I'm excited to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Rebecca Dudley. Rebecca Dudley is an assistant professor of political science here at Brigham Young University. She received her bachelor's degree from BYU in international relations with a secondary major in French studies, and received her MA and PhD from Duke University in political science. Her research emphasis is on security and conflict. She focuses in her courses and in her research on conflict processes, conflict resolution, and foreign policy. She is one of our faculty research fellows this semester here at the Kennedy Center. She's previously been a Hans Morgenthau Fellow at the Notre Dame International Security Center as well. Rebecca loves college basketball, and so today is actually a pretty good day for her. She will be speaking on the topic Vive la Résistance, the diffusion of violent resistance in Nazi-occupied France. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Dudley.
Thank you, Professor Meekum, for the very generous introduction. And indeed, I love college basketball, and I'm very excited about BYU's win last night and looking forward to the next month or so. But as much as I love college basketball, I will go on the record saying I love the BYU Kennedy Center even more. And I've been a huge fan of the Kennedy Center programming since I was an undergraduate here, and I am very excited to be here sharing some of my research today. So, as you have seen, and as Professor Meekum mentioned, my topic today is the diffusion of violent resistance in Nazi-occupied France. This is based on a research project that I have currently working with a colleague of mine in the political science department, along with one of his former graduate students, and in which we are looking at violent resistance actions undertaken by members of the French resistance during the Nazi occupation and Vichy France during World War II. For the presentation today, I will spend a good bit of time kind of situating the story for you, kind of shaping the context of French resistance, what French resistance looked like, and then share with you some of our data on what the resistance was doing during the occupation. So first, context of the French resistance. So a story that you are probably familiar with to a certain extent, but after the beginning of World War II, it only took a year or so before Germany decided to try its luck going around the Maginot Line and invading France. So this map kind of maps out the German onslaught, and this was a part of the Third Reich and Hitler's idea of Lebensraum, this idea of control over continental Europe. Hitler understood that France was one of the major potential bastions of resistance to the Nazi occupation, to the Third Reich. And so it was therefore very important to their strategic planning to make sure that France was neutralized. This worked better than anyone anticipated. If you will excuse me for the extended quote, historian Norman Davies writes this of the fall of France. The fall of France was one of those bone-chilling events which marked the end of an era. France had been regarded as a major military power for 3 centuries. The victory of 1918 was supposed to have redeemed the disaster of 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. Yet the French army, with British and Polish support, was now knocked out by the Nazi Wehrmacht in less time than Germany and Russia together had taken to knock out Poland. 1940 showed that 1970 was no aberration. The German invaders held no overall numerical superiority, not even in armored vehicles, but their panzer divisions waged this second blitzkrieg with great dash and vigor. The impregnable Maginot Line, which did not reach into Belgium, was simply bypassed, and the panzers drove a steel column between the British in the north and the main French grouping in the center. When the outflanked French forces withdrew, they were pursued by an opponent moving with far greater speed and firepower. The BEF was totally beaten and stranded on the dunes of Dunkirk in northern France. It was a shock, and historians have debated to a certain extent the logic of what happens next. Germany comes in, and the French government, internally debating amongst itself what the best thing to do is, the idea of either becoming a government in exile, maybe in London, like the Polish government had done, or trying to salvage some level of autonomy, which is ultimately what happens, or is at least what is claimed to be the logic behind what happens next. So France signs an armistice, the second armistice at Compiègne, which is ironically but also symbolically the same place that Germany signed their ceasefire at the end of World War I. After this blitzkrieg success of the Wehrmacht, France signs an armistice with Germany. Germany believed this would be temporary until the British came to terms, but this ended up lasting until the Allied liberation of France after D-Day. This dissolves the French Republic, and the French state, as it's now known, was established with nominal authority over the entire country of France, although in practice only given authority over the Free Zone. This becomes a division known as the Zone Occupée and the Zone Libre in the south, or as we often will refer to it, Vichy France, the government of France relegated to a former resort town that just happened to have enough hotel rooms to hold all of the former French officials, while they welcome the German occupying force in the north, mostly military divisions. Some other critical pieces of this armistice included the fact that all of the French soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them, were going to remain prisoners of war and were taken to Germany under these auspices. Alsace-Lorraine, the region in northeast France, we see here in the dark green, that had been fought over between Germany and France for decades now, was re-annexed by Germany. France would only be allowed a military force of 100,000 soldiers, and they would be focused on internal security. And another piece that would be critical to understanding what life is like under this occupation, France is forced or agrees under the terms of this armistice to pay the costs of the occupying German force, which turns out to be about 20 million Reichsmark a day. So what does life look like under Nazi occupation and Vichy France? In theory, we have a division here between the occupying force in the north and a collaborationist government in the south. But in practice, the collaboration between the Vichy regime and the occupying Nazi force was so strong that there was a lot of similarity in the experience between the north and the south. The zone occupée in the north and the zone libre, the occupied zone and the free zone, would later be renamed the northern and southern zones, Zone Nord and Zone Sud, in November of 1942, after Germany opens the Eastern Front in the USSR. So we have the German military administration in northern France and a collaborationist Nazi puppet regime, essentially, in southern France, centered in Vichy. Historians have debated the extent to which the Vichy regime's collaboration was necessary for France's survival, whether that was the smartest strategic move to make. Marshal Pétain, who was a war hero in France, the hero of Verdun after World War I, would be the leader of the Vichy France government. And he would, to his dying day, say that it was necessary for France to do what the Vichy France government did. However, he and the rest of his administration would later be found guilty of treason once liberated by the Allies. The occupying force and the collaborationist regime were not great to the French citizenry. As I mentioned, the French prisoners of war were kept by the German military, taken in large part to Germany, and this had terrible repercussions for France's workforce. In addition, terms of the armistice and some would say greed of the Nazi occupation pegged an artificial exchange rate between the German Reichsmark and the French franc devaluing it by about 20%, so that German soldiers were essentially very, very rich in context, whereas the French working class and the French citizenry was unable to purchase what they needed. But even if they had the money to purchase what they needed, there were also endemic shortages that led to absolutely extreme want among the populace. There were a few things kind of leading to this. The administration of the country during this occupation period was not necessarily as organized as it could be. Alongside French resistance, to make this even more difficult, the infrastructure for transport, the infrastructure for agriculture was all severely decimated. The Allies in World War II, so we're thinking the US, the UK, and other countries like this, greatly limited their ability to trade internationally because the Allies placed a blockade around both Nazi-occupied France and the Vichy regime, so they weren't able to trade necessarily to get what they wanted. There were also severe economic issues associated with France being required to pay for the German occupation. And the fixed artificial exchange rate made these issues even worse. So German requisitions were able to be done very, very cheaply for German soldiers, but the French working class suffered gravely as a result. In addition, severe labor shortages as a result of the prisoners of war being held in Germany and other policies such as the STO, which I'll talk about in just a second, drastically reduced the amount of labor that was able to be conducted by France. And this also led to severe agricultural shortages. And out of the agriculture that was produced, a lot of it was taken by Germany. The average daily diet for French adults dropped from about 2,400 calories a day. It almost halved to between 1,200 to 1,500 calories a day. In response to these extreme shortages, the German government and the Vichy France government started severe rationing and severely restricting the amount of goods and services that the French people were able to acquire, even if they had the money to be able to do so. Most were making good with what became known as ersatz goods, or makeshift substitutes, things like wooden soles for your shoes instead of leather, and saccharin instead of sugar. The labor shortages in the countryside were in part due to the prisoners of war, but also in part due to a forced labor program undertaken by the German government called the STO, Service du Travail Obligatoire, necessary, obligatory work. This was a practice of forced labor by which hundreds of thousands of French men and women in their largely late teens, early 20s, early 30s, were enlisted and deported to Nazi Germany. This was ramped up even more post 1942 when Germany opened the Eastern Front. They, within Germany, started to face a severe worker shortage because of the enlistment going to the Eastern Front, and thus started pulling from some of their occupied territories in order to make up this demand in labor. Places like France and Poland and the USSR. However, due to the collaboration of the Vichy government, France was the only one of the occupied states who was sending their own citizens by decree of their own government instead of just the occupation. Trying to compensate for this lack of manpower in Germany, but making it the lack of manpower in France and also Poland and other occupied territories that were also facing this much, much worse. This propaganda poster that we can see here, the yellow and red, this is a propaganda poster for this STO. He's saying, I'm working in Germany for la relève, which was one of the terms for these social administrative programs to try to rebalance the worker shortage, for my family and for the France. Come be like me. This was a massive effort that greatly exacerbated the troubles of daily life for the French working class and the French citizenry. So what was being done in response? That is the context under which we have the French resistance. The French resistance springs up relatively quickly. So it is in 1940, late May to early June, that the Battle of France occurs. And France has more or less fallen by the first week of June. By the 14th of June, the previous Prime Minister, Renault, has given up his position. That's when Pétain takes over. But the resistance springs up pretty quickly. Often we point to a famous speech given by this man here on the left, Charles de Gaulle, a name you're probably familiar with. He actually formerly worked under Pétain, but refused to give up, refused to stop fighting the occupying German force. He was driven out of the country and gives a very famous speech called the Appeal of June 18th, L'Appel du 18 Juin, in which he compels or tries to call for the French people to continue to resist. There is a famous line that is often associated with this speech, but actually was not given during the context of this actual speech, where he says, France has lost a battle but has not lost the war. He continues to push for French men and women to resist, to push back against Germany, and to not consider Germany to have won this war. This radio broadcast is one of the most famous in radio broadcasting history, and actually arguably one of the most important political speeches of certainly the 20th century and definitely 20th century France. It, however, was not necessarily heard by as many people as we tend to talk about it today. It was rebroadcast a few days later to a wider audience, but we also, Charles de Gaulle was initially having a lot of trouble becoming the face of the resistance. He had a lot of trouble winning over the British in particular, and then also the Americans, because despite the fact that the British government didn't necessarily want him as the face of the French resistance, the U.S. saw him as a British puppet, which they didn't necessarily like and was also demonstrably false. However, he would spend the next several years continuing to gain this foothold, continuing his radio broadcast, continuing this push to try to get as much resistance as possible within France. This became a little bit easier once he kind of won the support of some of French Northern Africa and French Equatorial Africa, and that is where he kind of set up his own government in exile, although it was not recognized as legitimate government in exile of France. He considered himself to be the leader of Free France and would later be the leader of Free France and the Free French forces. While this was happening, there was also localized movements happening within France as well. So one thing to note about the French resistance is that it is not an overarching, formally organized organization that spans the entire country. Rather, when we say French resistance, we are referring to a loose network of somewhat related, but internally organized, but not necessarily working together, different cells, different movements within different cities. So they sprung up relatively quickly, although it took a couple years for them to really get a foothold. They sprung up as one resistance leader, Jean Cassou, he referred to this idea as the absurd refusal, le refus absurde, the absurd refusal to accept the fact that the Reich was going to win, and if it did win, that it would be better to resist than it would be to give in. This was a sentiment that was shared by Cassou as well as many other resistance leaders that were not necessarily collaborating with each other, but independently across different cities in France, starting their own resistance movements. Simultaneously, due to economic issues because of the occupation. There is a massive population demographic shift happening in France. So the cities are losing population pretty rapidly, and so we have resistance kind of flooding the countryside at the same time, and these would become known as the maquis. It is estimated that between 200,000 and 350,000 French citizens were active members of the resistance. This would be about between 1 and 3% of the population was actively involved in the resistance. The resistance had three main avenues of resistance. One is counter-propaganda, which generally took the form of the clandestine press, so underground newspapers kind of published secretly. Newspapers, one of the most famous is called the Museum of Mankind, le Musée de l'Homme. The second thing that they were doing was violent resistance, a campaign of guerrilla warfare targeting German authorities, Vichy France authorities, and infrastructure and property. And then the third thing that they were doing, that some historians have argued was the most important piece of the puzzle for the French resistance, is espionage, providing intelligence from within France to allies such as the UK. The UK was very supportive of this endeavor and actually used part of their SOE, the precursor to MI6, to kind of go into France and help to organize some resistance and kind of give some training in counterintelligence and things like that. But this was a celled organization, is the way we generally talk about it when we're talking about these types of movements, in that it's a bunch of different cells that are not necessarily coordinating with one another, but are working towards a broader overarching goal. But this also makes sense when we consider the makeup of the French resistance being very much very varied. So originally, largely conservatives and Catholics, but particularly after Germany opens the Eastern Front and invades the USSR, Stalin kind of gives the go-ahead for communist movements across Western Europe to join the resistance, to join the fight. And so the French resistance is also becomes associated with a lot of communist movements, and there are a lot of communist cells within the French resistance. But others as well, academics and students, aristocrats and the working class, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, liberals, anarchists, everyone had a place in the French resistance. So, in addition to the poor organization and the administration of the occupation, Vichy France and the occupying German force did not take kindly to the actions undertaken by the resistance. And over the course of the occupation, this would get more and more dire. So collective guilt was assumed. So individual members of the resistance, when they were discovered or found out or declared guilty, they were not only executed, but normally their families would be executed as well. Over time, as resistance activity did not curb, this became a policy closer to indiscriminate retaliation, where entire villages would be at stake because of the actions of suspected or found resistance members. This is famously still shown to this day in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, which was the site of a infamous massacre of over 600 citizens because of suspected and true resistance activity. The German military came in and rounded up the men, women, and children and massacred them and burned the city to the ground. Later, Charles de Gaulle would say that they would not rebuild the city and instead would leave it as a permanent memorial to the French resistance and those who suffered as a result. Okay, so that is the context in which the resistance is working. And I want to take the rest of my time here to kind of show you the work that I and my co-authors have been doing to examine what the diffusion of violent resistance looked like in the context of the occupied France. So this project introduces a new data set that we're very excited about. calling it the French Resistance Actions Data, or in political science, any good data set has a fun little acronym, so we're calling it FRAD. This is a novel data set on reported actions undertaken by the French resistance against occupation forces during World War II, both in the North and the South, both German occupying forces and military, and then the forces of Vichy France. This data is compiled from a cache of documents in the French National Archives. And this compilation is a set of police reports, for the most part, that were organized in the aftermath of the occupation. In the aftermath of World War II, the French government came together to try to organize these police reports, to try to sort through the actions that were taken, both by the occupying force, but most importantly by French citizens. And that is where we found this cache of documents, and that is the source of this data. So these reports share the date, the type of action, the target when it is known, and the type of targeted entity when that is known, as well as the location of these attacks, which includes information on the regional department and the municipality, but also, in a lot of cases, approximate addresses for where these violent acts were taken. This data, the work undertaken by the French government and then the work that we have done to compile this data, is a concerted effort to represents a set of actions that were undertaken as a concerted effort to target the organizational capacity and the operational capacity of the occupying forces and the organizational capacity of Vichy France. So I'm going to show you some maps based on the data that we have. We have about 5,500 instances of violent actions undertaken. I'm going to walk you through by year, by type, and then talk a little bit about the targeting and then the patterns of diffusion that we see. So this is our first cursory look. This is all of the actions that were undertaken at different points, and as we can see, broadly strewn across the entire country, because in large part of the demographic shift and the activity of the resistance in the countryside, we see that these violent actions were not necessarily limited to just cities, were not limited to areas of the highest population density. But one thing that I think is particularly interesting is to look at what this looks like, the growth of these actions over time. So in 1940, this is what violent resistance looked like. And as a reminder, we're looking here at the violent actions undertaken. We're not looking at the nonviolent or the espionage pieces of the French resistance puzzle, just the violence undertaken. This is exceptionally limited in scope, which makes sense because this is when the French resistance is first getting off the ground and trying to figure out how to organize themselves. In 1941, we see first a little bit of a dispersion in where the targets are, as well as a bit of an uptick. We see here a little bit more clustering in some of the more densely populated areas, particularly in the north of France. But we also see a substantial amount of dispersion into the countrysides. 1942 is when resistance actions begin in earnest. The result of Germany opening the Eastern Front, a lot of the administrative changes that made within France, bringing the STO to bear, things like that greatly increased the French resistance ability to mobilize and recruit and organize within themselves in order to undertake these violent actions. So in 1942 is where we really see the resistance come into full swing. And a few things to note here, we still see this dispersion across areas of population density, but we do see a good bit of clustering kind of around some of the more densely populated areas, but there's still plenty happening in the countrysides as well. In 1943, this is where we see the peak of resistance activity under the occupation. And was somewhat surprising to us, but seems to be even more activity in Vichy France than there is in the occupied zone. But that probably, we are speculating at this point, has to do with the operational capacity of the German occupation compared to Vichy France at this point in time. In 1944, that pattern becomes even more distinguished between the north and the south of France, but we still, again, see a relatively diffuse spread of these violent actions. And here is everything laid on top of each other by year, so we can kind of see these patterns of diffusion and dispersion across time. The next thing that I think is interesting to look at is the types of actions that were being undertaken. So we'll go again by year. And if you note here in the corner, we have different types of violent actions that were undertaken. So we have bombings, which you will notice are far and away the most, the favored option by the French resistance. And bombings is an inclusive term for any type of incendiary or explosive device. A lot of reports of things like grenades and things like that. So any sort of explosive is what we mean here when we say bombing. We then have murders and assassinations. This was a key piece of the puzzle for the French resistance, trying to assassinate murder collaborators, but also assassinate people as close to the top as possible. We have other violent attacks, and this includes generally things like assaults and kidnappings. Property damage, which includes, obviously, a lot of bombings also incur a significant amount of property damage. But here, when we say property damage, we're thinking about things like vandalism, broken windows, and a lot of the actions that the French resistance undertook to try to limit the infrastructure capability of the northern and southern France. We have a few select robberies. Based on the reports that we have, it appears that a lot of the robberies were focused either on trying to lessen organizational capacity, or were focused on stealing weapons and weapon systems. And then finally, in the yellow, we have shootings, which we do have a significant number of reports of as well. The shootings that do not lead to death, because those are included in the murder and assassination category. So note here, in 1941, we actually have a lot more kind of person-to-person types of violence. This is when we see a lot more murders, a lot more violent attacks, and property damage. And then when we move into 1942, as we see a lot more actions being undertaken, this is also when we start to see a lot more of those incendiary devices, the bombs, the grenades, the explosives being used. Oh, that was 1943, sorry. In 1943, this is when we see, again, really the peak of our resistance level violent actions, and we see bombings scattered, diffused, and dispersed all across Vichy France, as well as a lot of violent attacks and murders generally tend to be a little bit more concentrated in the more densely populated areas. And this pattern continues and is even stronger in 1944, when far and away we see bombings being used much more than any other kind of violent act, and very much concentrated in Vichy France. So you can see what this looks like in terms of all of our types of violent actions. This is about the breakdown. So greater than 50% of our violent actions are bombings, the use of incendiary devices, explosives, grenades, and bombs, targeting either individuals, property, or both, usually both. The next most used is murder, assassination for the most part, and then other violent attacks. And then we have a smaller number of property damage, and again, remember, this is property damage not inflicted by bombing, because that is incorporated in our other category, some shootings, and then a very small number of robberies. The reports don't have perfect data on the targets, so I didn't map this for you, but I do want to talk for a second about what the most commonly identified targets were. It tends to make sense if we think about what they were trying to do, trying to target the organizational and operational capacity of the German forces and of the Vichy France forces. But so it is mostly those organizations, those individuals that are being targeted. The German military and German authorities are most commonly identified as the targets, followed by the police, the French military. Then we have infrastructure that is not associated necessarily with anyone in particular. Then we have the Vichy French militia and the Vichy French military. And then finally we have, in smaller categories, local governments, generalized collaborators, which generally means individual citizens who are seen as having collaborated or actively collaborating with the government, and then political opposition in the French Popular Party. To sum up, a few patterns of violent resistance that we see. We see that acts of sabotage and guerrilla warfare using explosive devices are far and away the most common type of violent act undertaken by the French resistance. We also see that violent resistance spread quite quickly as the strength of resistance movements increased. It tracks very well to the number of resistance fighters, the diffusion across the country, and then the dispersion within the country as well. We also see, I didn't quite point this out, but we see a slight tendency toward infrastructure and property damage, a lot more in the less populated areas, a lot more in the countryside, and violent attacks to a certain extent concentrated in the cities and the more densely populated areas, but we still do see plenty of person-to-person violence and violent attacks happening in the countryside as well. Violent resistance is only one part of the story of the French resistance, but it is a critically important piece of the puzzle. And the French resistance, while it would not have been able to survive without support from abroad, was also ultimately a success and a key piece of the puzzle in the Allies' success in pushing Germany back on the continent. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion and landings at Normandy, commonly known as D-Day, were successful in large part because of the counterintelligence provided by members of the French resistance. Churchill would, at one point, note that the work undertaken by the French resistance toward D-Day did the work of about 6 infantry divisions, which is very substantial. After D-Day, the resistance, the paramilitary wings, the violent resistance within the French resistance was encouraged to join the Free French forces, the French forces of the interior, under the leadership of, at this point, Charles de Gaulle, or the Free French Army. And at that point, the shape of French resistance looks a lot different. But we're hoping through the course of this project and this data that we're going to be able to have make a much clearer picture of what the French resistance was able to accomplish within France. I'm excited to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Dudley. You've given us a lot to think about, and it's quite a compelling personal story. Involved a large number of people. We will take questions for the next 15 minutes. If you have a question, just please raise your hand. Nate in the back has a microphone. He will deliver to you. We invite you to stand and tell us your name. If you're a student, please tell us what you study here at BYU, and we will finish at 1 p.m.
I answered all possible questions. That's wonderful.
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I study interdisciplinary humanities. I'm wondering if you think how there are different groups around, but they weren't necessarily working together. What collective action problems or collective dilemmas do you think would have come from that?
That's an excellent question. Thanks, Lindsay. So that is one of the kind of key questions that we generally have when we're studying these types of resistance movements or social movements, generally speaking, is this question of collective action. And on the one hand, you have the idea that having kind of a more loosely organized organization, kind of having these loosely connected cells, might be able to help overcome some issues of collective action, because you don't necessarily have to personally agree with all of the actions that are being undertaken countrywide. But this runs into a much bigger issue when we're talking about mobilization and recruitment, because when you have smaller local networks, it becomes much more personal and harder to hit this threshold. One of the kind of theories in like mobilization and protest movements is that there's this latent threshold that individuals will have, and once you pass that threshold, everyone has a different threshold, and once you pass your threshold, you would be willing to join a movement. And when you have a smaller celled organization, that threshold becomes harder to cross. You also run into this issue of having all of these different identities under the umbrella of the French Resistance, and this is something that the French Resistance did run into, particularly when you have anarchists and communists and eventually even fascist movements within the French Resistance, where you have very different ideological beliefs driving kind of your ideal outcomes. And this isn't necessarily so much an issue at the personal level, and like I said, hopefully kind of this looser connection protects you, because if one cell is caught, that doesn't necessarily connect you to your cell. But what it does also do is it continues to anger the occupying force, right? And so the occupying force is not necessarily, well, it is not distinguishing between different ideologies within the resistance. All resistance action is working against the occupation. All resistance action is bad, and they're not necessarily distinguishing. So you, if your organization or your smaller piece of the puzzle is overtaken or overrun, then you might end up having to pay for other people's ideological choices. So there are some pros and some cons. Generally speaking, we think of these kind of celled organizations as being a little bit more difficult to spring up, but once they do spring up a little bit more, they're more difficult for the government to track down. So if you can get there, it tends to be a little bit more stable. And that is arguably what we find with the French Resistance as well. Great question. Thanks, Lindsay.
Hi, I was wondering, you mentioned earlier how the Vichy France, the leader there, said that he was okay with the structure that they have. He said that it was necessary. But later on, he was found guilty of treason. What is your point on that? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. And so Marshal Pétain, Philippe Pétain, is, I think, a fascinating character, someone who cared a lot about France, built his reputation off of becoming a war hero during the First World War, but decided pretty quickly at the outset of World War II that the most important thing was for France to have autonomy. And that was the value incentive structure that he set up for himself and ultimately for Vichy France, that a lot of resistance members and allies in other countries and Charles de Gaulle and others took a lot of issue with. As best as I understand it, I like to think that it is not the choice that I would have made, but as best as I understand Pétain's logic, his thought was, it is better for France to retain a sense of autonomy than to give in entirely. That France was the only one of the occupied countries that took this route. The Polish government became a government in exile. Other governments became completely subservient and were fully occupied by Germany. Only France was willing to sign this armistice and in the hopes of retaining a sense of autonomy. I would argue that the autonomy that they thought that they gained by making this move was not true. It wasn't true autonomy. They ended up having to be the only country, like I mentioned, that willfully enlisted and deported their own citizens to send to Germany for manpower. They are also end up being the only country, the only government that rounds up the Jews within their own country and sends them to concentration camps. I think that that kind of moral scarring is not necessarily something that is worth the autonomy that they thought they were getting, particularly when the autonomy didn't seem to exist in practice, since they were so scared of losing the semblance of freedom that they had, that they were willing to do whatever Germany wanted them to do anyway. But to his dying day, he defended it. He, instead of going off, instead of kind of taking the plea deal at the end, he decided he wanted to stand trial and was ultimately found guilty for treason and was sentenced to be executed, although at the request of the court, Charles de Gaulle personally commuted the sentence. He was 89 at the time, so he didn't live that much longer, but he stood by his decision despite the outcomes.
My name is Talis Barker. I'm studying mechanical engineering. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the nature of the government in Vichy France and what about it before the occupation and their relationship with Germany led to, well, kind of what happened. What led the occupied government to be in such a position where they kind of ended up working with the occupying force so readily, as opposed to any other country in Europe?
Yeah, a great question. And I don't necessarily have a great answer because I too am a little bit astounded that these are the choices that were made. One thing to note is that the fall of France in 1940 fundamentally shift the structure of the government, right? So what had been known as the French Third Republic comes to an end in 1940 and is replaced by what is called the French state, which again nominally has authority over the entire country, but in practice only has authority over the free zone, and then in further practice tends to give up that authority to whatever the German government and resulting occupying force wants. In terms of what it was about that government that led to this, we could talk about kind of French political culture and these centuries of shifting political institutions that there are some historians who have made the argument that the desire to have some semblance of normalcy and not revert again to complete occupation by arguably an empire, although we could debate the extent to which the Third Reich constituted an empire. But France has since the French Revolution, has a relatively difficult relationship with this republic to empire transition. And so I have seen some historians try to argue that it was so deeply ingrained in their political culture at that point that they wanted this republic, that they were willing to kind of give up some of their moral standing for some of this institutional standing. And that could be true. I think it also probably has a lot to do with the people in power at the time. The prime minister of the Third Republic, they had a president, but in name only, the president had no power really. Renault didn't want to, ends up, as I mentioned, giving up, resigning, because he did not want to do what Pétain ultimately decided to do. So you could also argue that this is kind of an individually driven outcome, where Pétain is willing to make these compromises because it is most important for him personally, and there are enough people kind of in that administration that they're willing to do that. A lot of it, as we often see in the context of war, has to do with the fact that they were shocked by their inability to withstand the German invasion. And that is a really scary thing when you know that Germany is willing to come in and bear down a lot of force on you, that makes governments willing to make compromises that they might not have thought they'd be willing to make. Great question.
Hi, my name is Blake Jones, studying economics. I was curious if you could share a little bit of insight on like the German response or kind of the impact that French resistance like had on the occupation of France, like how that affected their strategy or structures or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Blake. So the occupying force really, really hated the French resistance. This is probably not a surprise, and this got worse and worse over time. So as I pointed out, there's this infamous example of the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane, where we go from individual resistance members kind of being tracked down to kind of more collective guilt establishing that now their families are going to be killed as well, to, okay, now when we see resistance activity, we are razing villages entirely. So they become more and more brutal over time. Now, this is also obviously not happening in a vacuum. This is happening while Germany is also losing ground in other places, and the tides of the war are turning. But Germany and the occupying force becomes much more brutal against the resistance over time. And this is made even more necessary by the fact that the actions of the resistance are making it harder and harder for Germany to effectively administer and kind of to France as a whole. Yeah, great question. Thanks. Yeah, please.
I'm thinking this because of what just happened a couple of weeks ago in Berdyansk and this last week in the on the Azov Sea in the Ukraine thing, the Ukraine situation we have right now, where planes fell down, or a boat blew up. They're going after this. What have we learned about the right way and the wrong way? I don't know who's right and wrong here, but to respond to a resistance movement, are there things that the occupiers do that just make it worse, and things that they can, were these draconian village wipe? I know they did the same thing in the Czech Republic and other places, but were those effective, or did that just steal the resolve of the? What do we know about and this is more political science and history, I guess. But what do we know about the? What not to do as an occupier when there's resistance, and what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, excellent question, and certainly another one we could spend another hour on easily, but I will try to be brief. And I am also a political scientist, so more political science than history tends to be my forte. I think there's two answers to that question. One is the tactical answer, and then one is the moral answer. Tactically speaking, we know that what you need to do to deal with a celled organization like this, or an organization that is very grassroots from the bottom up, it is ultimately, tactically speaking, it is to do what Germany did, to extend to indiscriminate violence, to not take any prisoners, to kill anyone, and truly to be as brutal as possible, because that's the only way to weed out these sorts of grassroots movements from a tactical perspective. However, I think the more important answer to that question is the moral answer to that question, because ultimately, tactically, there's nothing that you can do to stop a grassroots movement in its tracks. One of our colleagues in the political science department shared this thought once that it really resonated with me, and I think it applies here as well. The idea that you can never kill an idea simply by killing those who presently hold it. The only way to stop an idea in its tracks is to change the circumstances by which that idea gains traction. So if you actually want to stop a grassroots movement like the French Resistance, you need to change the circumstance in which they are existing, in which they are succeeding. Now, that is probably a harder sell to tell Germany, oh, if you want to get rid of the French Resistance, you just have to, maybe be kinder, change the things that you're doing. They're probably not going to, they probably are going to prefer the brutalist tactical approach, but that's ultimately never going to be as effective as changing the circumstances surrounding resistance. Okay.
Thank you for participating in our discussion today. We are really grateful to have you here with us. Please join me one more time in thanking Professor Dudley.